First aid for burns. When you're dealing with burns in first aid, often people can get confused about whether you should use water or not use water. Now, in general, you're going to want to use water instead of anything else like butter, Windex, mayonnaise, mashed potatoes, whatever else. There's a whole bunch of myths around things that people recommend you use for burns that you shouldn't be using for burns. You should be using water. But even within that, sometimes you want to use water and sometimes you actually want to use nothing. So I want to separate this out and help people understand sort of the way to think about burns so this makes a bit more sense and so that this gets simplified and you're less confused. If an emergency is happening and you're on fire or there's a serious burn going on and you're thinking about something complicated, the reality is that you're in a state of mind where it's not really conducive to doing complicated thinking. So the simpler, the better. With that in mind, when you're dealing with burns in first aid, you still have your emergency scene management, scene survey, primary survey, secondary survey, ongoing care thing. In general, with burns, you're going to be stuck pretty much in the scene survey and primary survey with a bit of ongoing care. You're not really going to be doing secondary survey much. Within the scene survey, one big thing that you're focused on, or you should be focused on, is dealing with the hazard. If you are currently on fire, if there is a chemical on you that is burning through you, if there is something on you that needs to be removed because you're actively being burned by it, deal with the hazard. Before you're even concerned about the medical side of this or the first aid, deal with the injury side of this, if you're actively being injured, address that first. We're going to say in a bit later that for third-degree burns, you don't want to flush it with water. If you are on fire and it is causing further and further degrees of burn, you can use water, put the fire out. So first thing, stop the burn from actively continuing. Whether that be applying of water to lower the heat of a heat burn, putting the fire out, smothering the fire, washing chemicals off you, whatever, remove the hazard from the equation. That's the first thing. Second thing, you need to figure out what type of burn this is. Now, when you're analyzing burns, there's two different sort of categories we think about. The first is how severe the burn is, and the second is what type of burn the thing is. I'm going to give you the list of these, then focus on the first aid of how you would go through like a basic heat burn basically, and then I'll expand on those lists after I do that. For the different types of severity, so when you're looking at how severe something is, you've got three main components. Component number one is how much of you is burned. There's this great thing called the rule of nines, which is often used medically as kind of a ballpark to determine how much of the body has been burned. We'll put up a diagram here showing the rule of nines and giving you guys a general idea for what that looks like. Basically, each part of your body is some multiple of 9 or 18, and when it all comes together, plus the 1% for the one part, it makes up your whole body as a percentage. How much of you has been burned? Number two, is there a particularly vulnerable part of you that's been burned that's more critical? Your neck is more important than your wrist. You need this to breathe. You don't need your wrist to breathe. Certain parts of the body that are more vulnerable, higher risk of infection, higher risk of things going really bad really fast, are going to be a more severe burn. That's number two. Number three, the depth or the degree of burn. You've got first, second, and third degree. You also have fourth, fifth, and sixth, but in first aid, you basically have first, second, and third plus. How deep is the thing? Once again, if we can put up some basic visuals of first degree, second degree, and third degree burn for a basic idea for how deep in the skin we're going. I'll explain that more in a bit later. As for the types of burns, and I have with me some props here. So we have heat burns from, touching the stove or scalding water, etc. We got heat burns. Chemical burns. This is rust inhibitor. This is not very good to put on your skin. So chemical burns, chemicals that get on you that can burn, and you have dry and wet for that, which is slightly different, but chemical burns. Electrical burns. So, fork and wall socket, don't do that. So we have electrical burns, being burnt by an electric current, and there's two different types of these, contact and flash burn. And light burns. This is not enough light. Usually we're talking about sunburns. These are radiation burns more specifically. So radiation burns caused by radiant energy People will often also sometimes think of them as light burns. First aid for this. Let's do basic heat burn. You're in the kitchen, you're making some food, moment of forgetfulness, you grab hot steel that was just on a burner, you forget the oven mitt. Your hand's burning, you drop it, maybe there's a bit of a scald too. Fine. Number one, deal with the fact that you're actively burning. At this point, you want to make a judgment call of, are we calling 911 or not? Very often, if it's really bad, you just want to call an ambulance anyways. But either way, depending on that judgment call, immediately go find water, use cool water, and deal with the fact that you're actively burning. We're not focused on the first aid wrapping of this yet, or the continual dealing with the injury. We're focusing on trying to reduce the injury because the hazard is actively on you. You're still burning. Your skin has been raised in temperature to a very high degree. So go to water, get cool water. It's like, you don't need freezing cold water. Water has a high heat transfer rate. Cool water is enough. So run your hand under cool water, submerge it in cool water, put your hand in a sink with cool water in it, with the drain slightly draining, with cool water re-entering to cycle it. Because if you have your hand that's hot and you put your hand in a pool of still cool water, it'll heat the water up. Whatever, deal with the fact that you have heat on you. Once you've dealt with that, you can do your regular first aid. Make sure you run through your scene survey, go through your primary survey, check for airway and breathing being impaired. Generally, for a simple burn like this, that's not going to be an issue. If the person goes unconscious due to pain, then you have to address that. But let's just assume they're conscious. Once you've put water on that thing, for some guides and some medical advice recommends up to 30 minutes, so it can be quite some time, you want to wrap the injury. Now, in terms of wrapping the injury here, burns do not have a bleeding, blood loss component generally. Wounds tend to either be, they're kind of like on a spectrum in my mind. So you have your infection risk and you have your blood loss, repeated blood loss risk, and you have sort of wounds that go somewhere on the line here. Your severe bleed or amputation is maximum blood loss. Your burn is maximum infection risk. You're not really losing blood with burns. The areas have been cauterized away. There's no repeated blood loss. There is some initial blood that's burnt away when the tissue's lost, but it's not repeated. Because of this, though, there's no blood pumping out the infected material. So this is really high infection risk. When you put something on this, you want it to be non-stick and you want it to be really, really clean. For the bleed stuff that we talk about in other videos, you don't really care as much if the thing is sterile. If they're bleeding a lot, it's really about pressure. This isn't about direct pressure. This is about a sterile environment and not having the thing stick to them. You really do not want an adhesive or linty or a lot of like loose things that stick to the environment on this sort of wound. You can use sterile gauze pads, which are usually sort of multi-purpose. They're designed for burns and they're kind of an initial covering that will work for severe bleeds too, but sterile gauze pads are fine. And then there's a number of sort of burn dressings you can use. I would not recommend a lot of makeshift sort of dirty clothing. So some people will like use socks or like, t-shirts that have been rolled around in mud, whatever, to secure an amputation. That's fine for an amputation. For this, the infection risk is too high. It's generally not worth it. So cover it as best you can. Because this is a burn injury in particular, a heat burn, you can have this be a moist dressing, that's fine. When you tighten it or when you secure it with a bandage, don't tighten it so tight to cut off circulation. And frankly, you don't really need to apply much pressure at all beyond what's necessary to secure that thing so it doesn't move. You're not using as much force as you would normally use to secure a bleed because the thing is not actively bleeding. Okay, so that's essentially what you're looking at. Other than that, you manage shock as necessary. Go through the regular first aid that you do for any basic injury, and then off to the hospital we go. Let's talk about how things change based on if the depth or degree is different. A first degree burn doesn't have blisters. A second degree burn that's deeper will have blisters. If you pop blisters, then it becomes an open wound and the infection risk increases. As long as the blister is maintained, then the skin is still protecting the body from stuff getting inside it. You generally do not want to pop blisters, and if someone pops a blister, you want it to be a doctor or a medical professional that's doing it for you. A 3rd-degree burn is a burn that's so deep the blisters have popped and you have open skin, open tissue underneath. When you have open wounds like this where stuff can get inside easily, the first aid will change slightly because you don't want to wash stuff that's in the upper part of the arm or wherever into it. So the cleaning of wounds before you wrap it will change. You'll want to use gauze pads or very sterile material and gently wipe away things that are in the area. You don't want to wipe towards, you don't want to just necessarily flush inside. So, you may be flushing the area to get the heat off, but once the heat's off and you're going into the bandaging part, you stop flushing the area, you're no longer dealing with the hazard. This is the major difference between 1st, 2nd, 3rd. If you have a 2nd-degree burn and you pop the blisters, what you've effectively done is forced yourself to do the first aid for a 3rd-degree burn because you have an open wound now with high infection risk. Heat burns, that's pretty much it. There's a whole bunch of different sorts of burn dressings you can look at, but in a general first aid kit, you're probably just going to have the dressing, the standard gauze pad, and maybe some triangular bandages or some roller gauze. Roller gauze looks like this. So, hello, that's roller gauze, which you attach on as necessary. And then, well, I have one hand here, but you attach on and then you roll around to secure. So, roller gauze, we just roll it around and roll it around and roll it around, etc. to secure whatever it is. So you can use roller gauze to secure your basic dressing there. That's pretty simple. When we get into other things like chemical burns, though, things will change slightly. Chemical burns are very similar to heat burns in that you're going to be flushing to get the thing off you. If I were to, I'm not going to because I don't want to be screaming right now. If I were to spray myself with rust inhibitor and it was to be on my arm, for example, similar to the heat burn, if there was like a scald on my arm, I would be applying water to get the hazard off me. In the case of the heat burn, I'm getting the heat off of me by transferring it through the water. In the case of the chemical, I'm washing the chemical off of me. Now, if it's dry, you can brush off residue and then flush it with water. If it's wet, just flush it with water. The reason why they recommend brushing off dry material and then flushing with water is that some of these materials, when you hit them with water, will activate and will cause a chemical reaction on you that will be more rapidly hurting you than the thing currently is. You have to get it off you anyways because it's actively burning you. But if you can have less of it on you before you flush, it can make the part 2 a bit less painful. But you have to get the thing off you. So you're using water in both cases for that sort of hazard part. Once you've dealt with that, the bandaging is the same as a heat burn. The thing's off you, is it 1st, 2nd, 3rd degree, bandage is appropriate, same thing. Electrical burns. We've got our electricity. Now with electrical burns, if you have a flash burn, this is when the electricity contacts you and then it basically hits and then kind of arcs off. So it's not going through you like a contact burn would. With a flash burn, it basically just kind of like bounces off you. It's hard to really explain, but it's localized to the area. With flash burn, you usually have a 3rd degree burn, so you pretty much treat it like a heat burn. On the hazard side, for electrical burns, you need to get them away from the hazard as best you can. If they're connected to a live active current and you don't know how to deal with electrical hazards, don't touch them or don't get involved in it because you might just go unconscious with them connected to an active circuit. General recommendation, if you're not sure how to deal with electrical burns, if you're at home, for example, find the main breaker and turn it off. So just cut the power. If you cut the power, then they shouldn't be connected to it anymore. If it's a live power line outside and you're not a trained electrician or you don't know what you're doing with this, don't mess with giant live wires. It's too dangerous. If you know what you're doing, fair enough, but that's kind of out the scope of a first aid thing on the internet. So for the flash burn, it's basically a 3rd degree burn. The one difference here is there's no active hazard on them anymore. Once you've removed it, the burn's kind of done. So you don't need to flush anything. And actually you want to use dry dressing in this case because the risk of getting infected material in it is too high. So you don't want to introduce water in this case. The hazard removal doesn't involve water. It's just get them away from the active current. With contact burns, first aid is also the same, get them away from the current. However, if I have a contact burn, so I'm connected to a circuit and it's attached to my hand and it exits in my, in my foot, that means the current had to go through me, and I could have internal injuries. I could have organs that have burns going through them and all sorts of fun stuff. So you have to find, ideally in a first aid situation, the entry and the exit wound, and bandage is necessary. All the different third-degree burns that are going to be along them, at minimum, you'll have the two. All contact burns like this are 911 calls. You never know what organ's been hit. They need to be assessed in a hospital. All of these are go to a hospital and find out, because you don't want a surprise that an organ has failed, 6 hours from now. So just keep that in mind. That's basically electrical burns. Once again, very similar to the other heat burn stuff. The only major difference is the hazard you have to treat a bit differently, and you're not using water in this case. You're not wetting the dressing, okay? Light burns, radiation burns more like. For radiation burns, we've got usually sunburn is what happens here, but you could have nuclear radiation. You could have any sort of radiation. If I, shone this light in my eye for long enough and just stared right into it, I could get a light burn on my eyeball. In the case of radiation, what is actually happening is there's too much energy in your cells from the radiant energy basically blasting them. You can't really take that off. So you can't remove the hazard from the person that has already hit them. What you can do is stop them from continually being hit by the hazard more. So if they're in the sun, get them out of the sun. If they're being burnt in a tanning bed, shut off and get them out of the tanning bed. Whatever. Stop the continued energy that's being put towards them. On the hazard side, that's all you can really do. On the first aid side of this, everything is pain management. What's burnt is burnt, and the energy in them really isn't going anywhere. You have to wait for this to resolve, and it's a medical problem. You can't really do anything in first aid for this. So if they're in pain, manage pain as best you can. Cool cloths can help. Towels, wet towels can help, but sometimes it sticks to them and then they scream more, so be careful with that. I wouldn't use ice directly on skin because it could fuse with it basically and then rip skin off, so don't put ice directly on this stuff. And as an added caution, what people will often do if they have a sunburn is they'll jump in the pool or they'll jump in water with the sun overhead. What happens with that is the sun hits the water and refracts, and then they actually get hit by more sun rays than if they were standing there. So they go from being kind of burnt to really burnt, and that's how you basically make the rock lobster. So I would not recommend doing that. And it's intuitive. You think, I'm going to do that because it's, water makes me feel good, but it doesn't help. It's not a very good idea. Okay. I want to have a little aside here talking about water, but this is something that we like to reinforce when it comes to talking about the importance of water in burns, and something that I just feel like you should know. Why use water? Why am I focusing on water so much? Why not all these other sort of things? Why did I not mention aloe vera gel, etc.? First aid is about the first sort of 10 minutes that you're dealing with an emergency. The long-term pain reduction stuff and long-term healing is irrelevant to first aid. So any of these ointments or creams or lotions that help skin repair long-term, first aid doesn't care. It's irrelevant. Really, first aid is about getting you into a non-emergency situation, getting you to a hospital, getting you from, oh no, am I gonna die, to, okay, I'm gonna live, let's focus on healing now. Right? That's what first aid's about. For that reason, a lot of these other sort of gels and ointments and whatever aren't really relevant. They're not getting the heat off of you fast enough. Water, 2 reasons why you want to use it. 1, water has the highest heat transfer rate out of any chemical that exists that we know of really on the planet that is not harmful to the human body. There are other chemicals that transfer heat faster, but they complicate the medical situation. They can sometimes cause chemical burns, so you don't want to use them. But water just works better. If you want to put heat onto something or take heat off of something, water's just more effective at it than anything else. Water just works better. That's the first reason. The second reason, and this goes into potentially gory details here, if you put non-water on your burn, so the classic example is toothpaste. You put toothpaste on your burn, you go to burn ward, you go to the hospital. By the time you get there, that toothpaste has stuck to your skin. They need that wound to be clean so that they can assess it for all sorts of other issues. They can see if you have infection risk, necrosis, whatever. So they need that thing to be clean. They're going to clean that wound. Now, there are many ways they can clean that wound. If you're lucky, they'll have medical grade maggots that only eat dead skin and will clean it away. But sometimes debridement and other things like that can involve taking steel tools and scraping off whatever you've stuck to your skin. Depending on your circumstances, they may not even put you on painkillers because they may need to assess you on pain scale in the area for nerve damage. It just depends. Burn ward is very unpleasant. Medical staff do not enjoy doing this. Having people scream because they put toothpaste on themselves is not fun, but people do it. Other things that I've heard that people recommend all the time, which are a very bad idea because you should just be using the water. Windex got popular for a bit after My Big Fat Greek Wedding came out. Mayonnaise has been recommended all over the place. Any sort of mashed potato, mashed sweet potato, etc. people have recommended. Peanut butters, cashews butter, almond butters. Pick your favorite type of butter that people have recommended. People have recommended butter. Butter was actually first aid for this about 90, 100 years ago, but we realized it wasn't a good idea and that got course corrected to just water. Avocado spread gets recommended. Aloe vera gel gets recommended, but that's not for the first aid burn covering. That's for like post first aid, helping you with comfort. That like it's not usable. It's not used in first aid for it. Manuka honey. Medical grade honey gets recommended for this all the time because it has antibacterial properties. However, the reality is that this is sticking to you, and Manuka honey is not generally recommended in the first aid emergency. It's recommended for post first aid and recovery sometimes. Having that stick to you can create problems. It depends. Also, generally speaking, how do you have access to Manuka honey and not access to water? Do you know how expensive Manuka honey is? John, can we put up some listings for how expensive this stuff is? How can you afford this? No. Eat it. What? Anyways, so just use water, please. It works better. It makes your life less complicated. It's generally plentiful. If you're in an area that doesn't have water, damn.